Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum, benedicta tu in mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus. Sancta Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostre. Amen.
Traditionis Custodes, the new motu proprio from Pope Francis. Well, it's not so new. It came out quite a while ago, but apparently it had caused quite the controversy initially when it did come out amongst those of us in more traditional Catholic circles. Joining me to discuss the new motu proprio is longtime friend of the show and my chief anti-Sedevacantist correspondent, Contra Sedevacantism. Contra, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so what we're going to do, and please, if you guys have any questions or comments, please comment them in the chat. We'll get to them, hopefully. But for now, we're just going to go through a few questions of my own first as we build up, some of the main points that the motu proprio is going to hit. So Contra Sedevacantism, or Contra for short, the first thing I want to ask you is, the level of authority this motu proprio has on us. What sort of level does it have? How binding is it on priests and bishops? Is it something they must submit to?
Well, considering the Vatican I defined that the Pope has authority over disciplinary matters, which would also include liturgical rituals and so forth, this would be strictly binding on all bishops, all cardinals, and all of the faithful. So it would be a strict obligation, not merely something that we can deviate from without sin.
I see. What about those who would say that Pope Francis, in issuing the motu proprio, was acting ultra vires, beyond his authority? Do you think that there's, any support for such argumentation?
Well, depending on which approach traditionalists would take, one could appeal to certain, authorities, such as the church fathers, who would suggest, say, that things outside the form and matter of the Mass pertains to the substance of the rite. And so it depends really on, the approach you take. From my position, no, the Pope is not acting outside of his authority. But depending on the person you're debating, they might, in fact, argue along these lines. So then we would have to delve into really what the basis of their arguments are, which we might be able to get into now.
Right. So we've gone over the basis for rebellion before, from those who take a much more hardened stance and say that every pope since John the 23rd is not actually a pope, but really an anti-pope, and their elections are either invalid or they acted so contrary to the faith they gave up their office. Now, I believe that we both agree that those arguments are non-starters. Could you just give us one quick summary for why these are not good arguments or a good position to take? Of course, don't repeat what we've already said before, but what would be a succinct argument that you can make in an elevator pitch? Do you think you can make something like that?
Sure thing. So it's not strictly confined to Sedevacantists, SSPX, and even those more traditionally inclined who are not members of the SSPX might in fact argue that the Pope is acting outside of his authority. In fact, Cardinal Berg did so just recently. So we have to examine the basis of their arguments. So the quick argument is from Chapter 2 of the 21st Session of Trent, which defines, as a matter of dogma, that the Church has authority to change whatsoever regarding things not pertaining to the substance of the rite. So I can change any of the sacramental rites outside of the form and matter of the sacrament itself. Now, this particular phrase, substance of the sacrament, so this is an important phrase to keep in mind. So what does Trent mean by substance of the sacrament?
And we can actually... would that mean, so for example, no pope could say that instead of using bread and wine from now on, what we're going to be using is Pepsi and peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. Like, no pope could say that that is the new matter of the sacrament of the Mass. Or they can't say, okay, what we're going to do is take out the words of institution, and there will be no words of institution at all in this. Instead of the words of institution, you will just recite Ring Around the Rosie. Some like argument, like no pope could do something like that, could they? Like, that would pertain to the substance?
Yes, that's exactly what the substance of the sacrament refers to. It's the matter and form. Now, the question is whether, when Trent uses the phrase substance of the sacrament, whether it also pertains to things outside of the form, matter, and intention. So, this is the question we have to actually delve into. And so, what does Trent mean by substance of the sacrament? First and foremost, we can appeal to historical sources within the time frame of the Council of Trent. We can appeal to the Catechism of Trent. Now, if anybody has a PDF or doc form version of the Catechism, they might just type in substance of the sacrament and how the Catechism interprets that particular phrase. And when it does, it always appeals to the matter and form of the sacrament. And the second thing we can appeal to is Sacramentum Ordinis by Pius the 12th, when he's discussing regarding the instruments of ordination, whether they pertain to the substance or not. And so he appeals to Trent and its phrase substance of the sacrament. And he explicitly goes on to say that the substance of the sacrament, as used by Trent, refers to the matter and form. So these two particular sources we can appeal to. So, of course, traditionalists will say, yes, it pertains to the substance of the sacrament, but how about other things? Say, for example, making the sign of the cross over the chalice, or any of these sort of sacramental rites. Can the church abrogate these particular things? Okay, so we might appeal to, say, the church fathers. For example, I was debating a traditionalist recently who appealed to Saint Basil the Great, who says that ad orientem worship is of apostolic tradition or origin. Now, here we have to distinguish two particular things. So, when Saint Basil or any of these historical authors say it's of apostolic tradition or origin, we have to keep in mind that they are usually referring to liturgical rubrics, or what we might call lowercase apostolic tradition, not such that pertains to the faith. And so usually we distinguish, especially with Protestants, we distinguish between apostolic capital or bigger case tradition versus lowercase tradition. So something might be of apostolic origin, a liturgical practice might be of apostolic origin, but it's not such that pertains to the deposit of faith, And so this is the line of argument that they take. And the way that we refute this is by appealing to the 21st session of Trent and how authors interpreted that particular canon or that particular decree. And so the substance of the sacrament pertains exclusively to the matter and form and nothing else.
Excellent. All right. So, good summary on why the Pope does have authority, why he's not acting ultra vires, and why he does have authority over this sort of thing. So, thank you for summing up those arguments. Now that we've established that the Pope can indeed do this, we now come to the question, are Catholics obliged to believe that the Pope ought to have done this, or that he had good reason to do this? Because I think that there's a very funny line in The Simpsons where Homer tells Marge, see, I told you they could deep fry my shirt, and Marge says, I never said they couldn't, I just said you shouldn't. So the question now comes, can Catholics disagree on whether the Pope should have done this or should have released the motu proprio? Because I think a Catholic in good conscience could say, I don't think the Pope should have done this. It was a bad move, but I do recognize his authority to do so. Do you think that that's well within the right of a Catholic to say?
Well, we're actually free to disagree on prudential decisions, whether we can say, well, wasn't a wise decision. Sure, you can make that argument on a practical level, but here we have to distinguish whether his actions are evil versus whether they are prudential in terms of keeping the peace within the church. Now, within the lines of being obedient to the Pope, you can argue, okay, it was not terribly wise to come out with this motu proprio, but we can't go beyond that particular line where we go into pretty much schism and just deny the Pope's authority over liturgical matters.
All right, excellent. That's just what I wanted to hear. Pope Francis is indeed our father. Sometimes a dad can make a bad mistake, but that doesn't mean he's not your dad, and that doesn't mean he doesn't have the authority to act in that position. So I think that's a very fair summary. Now let's get to the next question. All right, so in terms of like the pastoral emphasis, there are some people who are going to be scandalized by this motu proprio, unfortunately, and they might be tempted in this regard to turn to the Society of St. Pius X. A society who's at the very least canonically irregular. Although me and you have argued on this channel before that it's fair to say it's a sort of mixed schism. Others might even go into a full Sedevacantist line of reasoning. How would you suggest one talk to people who might be tempted to go down these lines if they're faced with the notion that they can't even go to a Latin Mass anymore because of certain geographical issues?
I think most of the SSPX and those who follow their line of thinking usually have a complicated appeal to various canons and decrees of historical sources, such as Canon 13 of Trent, Quo Primum, and all these forms of rational justifications for their actions, which we addressed within the video we did on the Contra SSPX. And so usually this is what they're going to appeal to because they've been formed in this form of thinking. So that's the first thing we need to address. Now, going back to one of the questions you asked previously, so can the Pope in fact abrogate a right of the Church? Now, Canon 13, as we discussed previously, says supposedly that no one can tamper with the rights of the Church. Now, the term rights simply means any form of sacramental rights, not exclusively to the Eucharistic liturgy itself. It can refer to the sacramental rights outside of baptism, confirmation, so forth. It's not exclusive to the Eucharist. And so if we go to various canonists or theologians and how they interpret these canons and decrees, they'll always say that the Church has authority. It, in fact, is the only authority that is able to institute these sacramentals, and no one else can do so. So it's, in fact, claiming its own authority over liturgical matters. Now, whether the Pope can abrogate a particular right, yes, he can, because this is explicitly said by Canon 5 of the 1917 Code of Canon Law, which says that the Church may abrogate even universal and immemorial customs. Now, although the 1917 Code of Canon Law is not strictly dealing with liturgical matters, as Canon 2 of the same canon says, it still encompasses the liturgy within the overall disciplinary authority of the Pope.
All right. Thank you for that. So he has the power to do it. He has the authority. We might disagree on whether he should or shouldn't, but he definitely can. If he can, there's no question about it. We can't escape by going to a society which has a very shaky foundation or connection to the Roman Catholic faith. Now, let's touch on some of the aspects in the motu proprio. According to Article 1, we read, "The liturgical books promulgated by St. Paul VI and St. John Paul II, in conformity with the decrees of the Second Vatican Council, are the unique expression of the lex orandi of the Roman Rite." Could you break down what he means by this?
Yeah, so we have to actually backtrack a little bit, because when Paul VI changed, the liturgy. He, in fact, had no intention of creating an altogether new rite. He, in fact, intended to retain essentially the Tridentine rite in all its essentials. And we have his letters to a particular, I think it was a French theologian, where he explicitly says this. And so when the Pope changed the liturgy, this was to be the expression in its reform fashion of the law of prayer as a law of belief. And so it's to express the Roman faith. And so, of course, traditionalists will argue, well, this is not actually reality. We can simply assess that this is not the same rite. And so Pope Francis is probably of the same mind that this is merely continuity of the Tridentine rite, but in its reform fashion. And so when say various traditionalist authors argue it does not retain the same faith, well, we have to ask ourselves, okay, what is the basis of your accusation? And so the primary accusation is usually that the new Mass supposedly denies the sacrificial nature of the Mass. And so how do we address this particular line of argument? Well, within every Mass, we have the form of the Mass, which is sacrificial in its nature. This is my body, which is given up for you. This is my blood, which is shed for you. So within its very form, we have the sacrificial nature of the Mass indicated, regardless of the exterior liturgical acts.
Okay, so to sum it up, the lex orandi is just how we express our prayer in the Roman Rite, and he's basically, by he I mean Pope Francis is basically expressing that in continuity with his predecessors. Correct? Are you there? Oh, I think Contra might be having a few issues. In the meantime, to sum up what we have so far, Pope Francis is well within his authority to act in this manner. Pope Francis definitely can. The appeals made that he is acting ultra vires do not stand. The motu proprio is something we are all bound to on pain of sin. And with the last part, it is indeed the lex orandi of the Church, how the Church manifests its prayers through the Roman Rite. Contra, do you want to add anything to that?
Sorry, I missed your little session.
Oh, no worries. I was just summing up what we had in the interview so far. But I did want to touch on a few other questions, if that's okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. So in terms of like its legal standing, we know where we're at. Now, what are the practical consequences of this? What happens now that the motu proprio has been released? What do priests who want to say the Latin Mass, what do they have to do now if they want to say it?
So, on a practical level, priests can no longer, appeal to the Summorium Pontificum of Benedict XVI, where he gave universal permission to use it. So his argument was previously that it was never abrogated to begin with, but now Pope Francis does, in fact, abrogate the traditional Latin Rite. And so on a practical level, priests have to appeal to their bishops to use this particular form of the Mass. Now, the question becomes, okay, what is the practical effects? So for those liberal-minded bishops, we call them liberal, what their, beliefs are, we can't assess on at least what they say outwardly, but through their actions, they're liberal in the sense that they deny the traditional Latin Mass. And so those who are inclined towards that direction will probably repeal the right of their priests to, well, it's not technically a right, but they will repeal their ability to say the Latin Mass. But those who are so otherwise inclined, they will tolerate or permit the use of the Latin Mass. But on like a universal scale, I don't think there'll be necessarily a decrease in the usage of the Latin Mass, but I could be wrong with time.
All right, thank you for that. And let's see what else we should discuss. All right, I think that's basically covered all my questions. I think we have a couple questions in the audience. Jeremiah or Ong says, I understand that the traditional Latin Mass was amended 3 times after a quo primum was issued. Father Casey in Breaking the Habit channel said so. Would you like to comment on that?
Well, I don't particularly recommend that particular channel. It is a more liberal bent, but quo primum itself needs to actually be understood within the context of. So when it says that it doesn't say the Pope can't change the Mass, but it's denying the ability of so-called pastors, local pastors, from doing so. So he uses similar strong language regarding changes to the breviary as well. So the appeal to quo primum, as we discussed in the previous video, and which I also discuss in my book, Contra Sedevacantism, it really doesn't work in our, it doesn't really work.
Thank you for that. If anyone has any other questions in the chat, feel free to ask. Gandalf, the greatest wizard, comments, he, that is Pope Francis, doesn't abrogate it, rather he restricts its use. That is correct. Pope Francis does not abrogate, but limits the use of the traditional Latin Mass. However, he does abrogate the previous motu proprio by his predecessor, now Pope Benedict Emeritus, the 16th. Would you like to add anything to that?
Well, yes, that's true. I might have misspoken previously.
Right. No worries. Sometimes this does happen, but Gandalf, the greatest wizard, thank you for catching that. Now, it doesn't seem that there's any more questions to be asked. Contra, would you like to address something in the motu proprio or something in general that I haven't touched on or our audience hasn't touched on that you think really needs to be emphasized or said?
Yeah, so on a practical level, it leads people to go towards the SSPX, essentially, those who are traditionally inclined and those who have a distaste for our Pope Francis. They're more inclined towards the traditional Latin Mass, but here we have to assess their status objectively and not simply appeal to emotions, or even to the complicated appeals to canon law such as Canon 13 of Trent or Quo Primum. I'd recommend anyone who's actually interested in the subject to go read my book, especially the topics of is the new Mass licit and is the new Mass valid, and assess these particular arguments, and to realize that their arguments or their appeals to these particular canons and decrees don't have any historical weight or substance. Regarding the SSPX and their status, we did a video on this. John Salza and Robert Cisco in the near future will be publishing a book, especially dealing with the subject of supply jurisdiction and the SSPX's appeal to it. And they will argue that as a community, they can't do so because common error, which we just previously, supposes that the group, the society itself, or the people, the faithful, assume that their bishops and priests have ordinary jurisdiction, which the society explicitly rejects that it has. And so when common error no longer applies, supply jurisdiction can no longer be appealed to. So we have to always caution those traditionally inclined or those who are already members of the SSPX to consider the status of the SSPX objectively and the return back into union with Rome. Now, from my perspective, it's rather an urgent situation, but I'm not trying to push any members of the SSPX out of the community without thoroughly dealing with all the historical issues related to, Vatican II or the new Mass. So I'd always recommend somebody go and read my book or any other author that tries to defend the new Mass and Vatican II. For example, recent Theology would be a good source for people.
I second that. Reason and Theology is a great channel for Catholics to follow. They do a much better job of keeping up with topics than I do. The men on that channel are just fantastic. Michael Lofton, Eric Ibarra, and William Albrecht are very amazing Catholic gentlemen who debate and defend the Catholic faith with a great and precise mind. Even at a certain point in the channel when they seem to be open to discussing things with the SSPX, they were also open to looking at the issue objectively, and they came to the conclusion that yes, Vatican II needs to be defended. Yes, the Novus Ordo needs to be defended. Yes, the powers of the Pope, even Pope Francis, need to be defended. And they do a terrific job of looking at the issue objectively, and for that I tip my hat to them. Now, we have some more comments in the chat. Let's see. According to Jeremiah Ong, the first Mass was a Jewish Passover liturgy. Jesus said to do this in memory of me. Doesn't this mean all Masses must follow the same rubric? Why is the Mass changed to TLM? Well, first off, all Masses are Passover liturgies, mostly because they have an in memoriam prayer. And do this in memory of me for the forgiveness of sins is usually there. And even when it's not, when Jesus says, this is my body, this is my blood, even that in itself is sufficient enough for it to be and connected to that first Mass that Christ himself hosted and instituted. So that's the first thing to go over. Contra might have dropped out for a bit. He'll be back. The second thing to go over is even the Novus Ordo does a terrific job of emphasizing the Paschal mystery of the Novus Ordo Mass, of all Masses, especially the one that we have today. So if you go on my channel, I have a video on that specific issue. I think one of the great things that Vatican II did was emphasize the Passover element of the Mass. I think that no matter what Mass we're really celebrating, it is a Jewish Passover liturgy. Yes, the first Mass that Jesus had is going to be very different from the traditional Latin Rite or the Rite of St. John Chrysostom or many others, but because they all have the same form and are of the same substance, they are the same Mass, really. That's why even though it's called the Masses, or we could refer to them as Masses, they're really the Mass. It's one thing. Contra, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, so regarding all the various liturgical, rites, so all these are, you can call accessories, although of apostolic origin, at least some of them. These would be called accessories, which contain certain elements of the deposit of faith, but simply because they contain these elements does not mean they cannot be passed on by some other means, even by other means of the liturgy. Now, the question is, so even supposing that the substance of a rite extends beyond the matter and form, the 21st session of Trent presupposes that the Church has the authority to determine what those elements of the substance are. So it's not for individuals to say, well, this does not pertain to the substance, or this does pertain to the substance. If you claim that we don't know what the substance of the rite is, as a church, then you're contradicting that very decree. So the Church itself has exclusive authority in determining what pertains to the substance, even if you extend this beyond the matter and form. And so by saying that he's acting outside, that is, the Pope is acting outside of his authority and changing the Mass, you're implicitly denying, or even explicitly denying, that the Pope has competence regarding the liturgy and its substance.
All right, thank you for that. And let's go to Geraleo, or Gloria Dominium. Gloria Domininium. Dominium? Okay, I'm sorry, I'm really butchering your name. I need to learn how to pronounce Latin words. Mea culpa, everyone. So he says, hello, I'm French. Bonjour. And here the situation is really chill. Oh, c'est mal. Do you guys think that basically the motu proprio is more meant for an American audience? I think he means with an American audience in mind, because something like that can be made to the whole church, but like in the back of Pope Francis' mind, he's like, I wouldn't have had to deal with this if it wasn't for those pesky Americans. No, I think this is more of a sociological question, but I can kind of see how Gloria can get this impression, because we typically tend to think of Americans as being more individualistic, and but they also tend to have a very severe religiosity because they're surrounded by Protestants. So that religiosity is very helpful in cultivating the faith. It could be that. I really don't have any strong opinions on that, but it seems like the Lefebvrean schism did operate heavily in France too. So I'm not sure if it's just like an American thing in mind. Contra, did you like to speak to that?
Yeah, actually, neither of those are true. The primary motive, or you could say those who led Pope Francis to make this decision, was in fact the Italian bishops themselves. So it was primarily an Italian, response or motive. They're the ones who were responsible for getting the Pope to make the changes. I'm assuming because there's, traditional movements within Italy, and of course France itself, which has a, you could call it traditional segment of the church. So these particular two countries would probably be responsible. At least their liberal elements are responsible for the motu proprio.
All right, thank you for that. It's nice to get the inside political viewpoint. And yes, most of these decisions do come out of Italy because, that's where the Vatican is. So it's important to keep that in mind as well. All right, let's see. Gloria also comments, what's interesting in the Roman canon in Latin is that Christ's words after the consecration aren't an order, do this in memory of me, but rather an affirmation that the priests do this in memory of Christ. That's an interesting liturgical point. Would you like to comment on that? Don't really think it has to.
No, I'm not. No.
No? All right. No worries. Yeah, I guess it's much more of a liturgical point, so it's not really too pertinent to the discussion. But yeah, it doesn't seem to be any more questions related directly to the motu proprio. But Contra, would you like to say any last words? I think now might be a good time to end the stream.
No, just what we discussed, I think would be probably sufficient.